It's spooky story time. Today we'll be reading The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs. This is an adapted version from EFLshorts.com, which is a great place to find some classic stories, but at an easier linguistic level. So let's get started with part 1. Part 1. The night was cold and wet, but in the small living room of LeBurn Villa, a fire burned brightly, and a father and son played chess. The father was a good player, but the son was better. His wife watched them play and warmed her hands in front of the fire. "Listen to that wind outside," said Mr. White. "I can hear it," said Herbert, his son. He looked at the chess pieces and moved one of the pieces. "Check," he said. "It's bad weather out there," said Mr. White. He wanted to distract his son, but it didn't work. "Checkmate," said Herbert with a smile. "This is the worst thing about living far away from town," said Mr. White. "Almost no one wants to come in this far on a stormy night." He was angry because he lost a game. "Perhaps you can win the next game," said Mrs. White. Mr. White looked up quickly and saw his wife and son smile at each other. He smiled to himself. Suddenly, there was a noise outside. His wife turned. "It's him," said Mr. White. He stood up and unlocked the door. Dead leaves blew across the floor. Then a tall man walked into the small room. "Sergeant Major Morris," said Mr. White. "Good evening," said the sergeant major, and shook hands with Mr. White, Herbert, and Mrs. White. Mrs. White gave him a chair, and Sergeant Major Morris sat down beside the fire. She made tea, and the sergeant major drank it slowly. He watched the fire and enjoyed the heat. When he finished his tea, he started to talk. The little family sat and listened carefully. They wanted to know all about their visitor. He spoke of different countries, great adventures, and strange people. 21 years of travel," said Sergeant Major. "When I left, I was a young man." "I want to go to India," said Mr. White, "and see the country. It's very beautiful, I think." "Better to stay at home," said the sergeant major, and shook his head. "Tell that story again," said Mr. White. "Tell the story of the monkey paw." The sergeant major said nothing, but his face was serious. "The monkey's paw?" said Mrs. White. "That sounds interesting." The sergeant major looked into the fire. Mrs. White took his cup and put more tea in it. "Very well," said Sergeant Major after some time. "You want to hear the story of the monkey's paw? So here it is." Sergeant Major Morris took a slow drink from his cup. Then he put his hand inside his pocket. "Look at it," he said. On his hand was a small, dry little paw. It was very old. Herbert took it from the sergeant major, looked at it closely. He gave it to his father. "What is special about it?" Herbert asked. He put it on the table. It did not feel very nice. "A strange old man put a spell on it," Sergeant Major Morris told them. "The spell gave 3 different people 3 wishes each." "What's bad about that?" Mr. White asked. "Sounds good to me." "Wishes are dangerous," said Morris. Suddenly, he looked afraid. "Did you have 3 wishes?" Herbert asked. "Yes," said Morris. His face went white, and his hand shook. He took a drink from his cup. "Did the wishes come true?" Herbert asked excitedly. "Yes," said Morris quietly. "Did anyone else ask for 3 wishes?" Herbert went on. "The first owner of the paw had his 3 wishes," Morris told him. "I don't know the first 2, but the last one was for death." All the people in the room went quiet. The wind outside howled. "I don't understand," said Mr. White. "Why do you keep it?" "I don't know," said Morris, and shook his head. "I thought about selling it, but nobody wants to buy it. They think it's a fairy story. So I want to try it first and then buy." He picked up the paw, looked at it, and then suddenly threw it into the fire. Mr. White cried out and took it out of the fire before it burned. "Better to let it burn," said Morris. "Can I have it?" asked Mr. White suddenly. "The fire is the best place for it," said Morris. Mr. White shook his head and smiled. He put the monkey's paw in his pocket. "You worry too much. How do you do it? How do you make a wish?" "You hold it in your right hand and make the wish. But I must tell you of the danger." "Sounds like a fairy story to me," said Mrs. White and stood up. Herbert and Mr. White laughed. Mr. White took it from the pocket again. Morris got a hold of his arm, looked him in the eye. "I warn you. Wish for something good." Sergeant Major Morris finished his stories and his supper. It was time for him to leave and catch his train. They all said good night, and Mr. White closed the door behind his friend. "I wonder," said Herbert, "is the story about the monkey's paw true?" Mr. White said nothing. "Did you give him some money for the little paw?" Mrs. White asked. "A little," said Mr. White. "He didn't want anything. He told me to throw the paw away." "Well," said Herbert with a smile, "we are going to be rich, famous, and happy. Wish to be a king, father." Mr. White took the monkey's paw out of his pocket and looked at it. "I have everything I want," he said, looking at his family with love. "Even kings don't have that." "What about buying the house?" Herbert said excitedly. "We only need £200. "Now that's a good idea," said Mr. White, and smiled at his wife. He held the monkey paw high in his right hand. "I wish for £200, he said, but suddenly he cried out and dropped the paw. His wife and son ran to him. "It moved," he said. Looking at the paw, it was now on the floor. "It moved in my hand." "Well," said Herbert, "I don't see any money." He picked up the paw and put it on the table. "Did you really feel that?" asked Mrs. White. Mr. White shook his head. Now he was not so sure. "Never mind. No one was hurt. I am old and I get afraid easily." They sat by the fire and stared at the flames. The wind outside grew stronger, and the windows shook. No one spoke. Finally, Mr. and Mrs. White got up and went to the bed. "Good night," said Herbert. "Perhaps the money is in a big bag in the middle of your bed," he said and laughed. His parents heard him, but they said nothing. Alone, Herbert sat and stared into the fire. At first, he felt good. The room was warm, and the fire was bright. But then he began to see faces. Faces in the fire. He watched. At first, the faces were not frightening, but then the faces began to change. The last face was so terrible, he nearly cried out. He got up quickly from his chair and put a hand on the table. By accident, he touched a little paw. This time, he cried out. Next morning, it was sunny. Mr. White laughed at himself. Why was I so afraid last night, he wondered. He sat at the kitchen table and ate his breakfast. The sun shone through the window and everything seemed well. He looked at the monkey's paw and shook his head. Mrs. White came into the room. She looked at the monkey's paw too. "All soldiers are the same," she said. "They have lots of stories, but none of them are true." "Perhaps it's true," said Herbert to his father. "Perhaps the money is going to drop on your head from the sky." Herbert laughed, but Mr. White did not. Sergeant Major Morris believed the story, and the paw moved in my hand. "I felt it," said Mr. White. Herbert stood up. "Well, I have to go to work, but when the money comes, don't spend it all. Please wait until I get back home," he said with a smile. Mr. White shook his head. Mrs. White laughed and followed her son to the front door. Herbert opened the door and said goodbye. Mrs. White watched her only child walk down the path and go to work. She closed the door and sat back down at the table with her husband. "Herbert likes joking," she said. Yes. Is that her husband? He does. And that's where we're going to stop. What I want you guys to do is below, tell me what you think is going to happen next. Mr. White wished for 200 pounds, but how is he going to get it? Go ahead and leave your predictions below, and I'll get back to you guys another time. Bye.